Sarah Martinez had always known she wanted to save lives. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her grandmother struggle with diabetes and saw how the local medics treated her with such care and dignity. That experience planted a seed that would grow into an unshakable determination to serve others in their darkest moments. After high school, Sarah enlisted in the Army and trained as a combat medic. The rigorous training pushed her to limits she never knew existed. She learned to work under pressure, to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death, and to carry equipment that weighed almost as much as she did. Her instructors noticed something special about Sarah. She never panicked, never gave up, and always put her patients first. Her first deployment took her to Afghanistan, where she was assigned to work with various special operations units. The landscape was harsh and unforgiving, with mountains that seemed to scrape the sky and valleys that hid dangers around every corner. Sarah quickly earned the respect of the soldiers she served alongside. They called her Angel, because she seemed to appear whenever someone needed help, often in the most impossible situations. The base where Sarah was stationed buzzed with constant activity. Helicopters came and went at all hours, bringing supplies and taking wounded soldiers to safety. She worked in the medical tent, treating everything from minor cuts to life-threatening injuries. Each day brought new challenges, but Sarah approached them with the same steady determination that had carried her through training. One evening, as the sun painted the mountains orange and purple, Sarah was organizing medical supplies when Lieutenant Colonel James Parker approached her. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much combat. His expression was serious as he pulled up a chair next to her workstation. "Martinez, I need to talk to you about a mission," he began, his voice low and careful. "We've got a special operations team going out tomorrow, and they specifically requested you as their medic." Sarah looked up from the bandages she was counting. She had worked with special ops teams before, but something in the lieutenant colonel's tone suggested this mission was different. The way he paused before continuing confirmed her suspicion. "This isn't a routine patrol," he continued. "Intelligence suggests there's a high-value target in a compound about 40 miles northeast of here. The SEALs are going in to capture him, but the area is known to be heavily defended. They need someone they can trust to have their backs." The request both honored and worried Sarah. She knew that special operations medics were chosen not just for their medical skills, but for their ability to fight alongside the team when necessary. These missions were dangerous, often taking place in remote locations where backup might be hours away. "Who's leading the team?" Sarah asked, already mentally preparing her medical kit for the mission. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson. You've worked with him before. He specifically asked for you after that incident last month, where you pulled 2 of his men out of that IED explosion." Sarah remembered that day vividly. The improvised explosive device had torn through a convoy, leaving 2 SEALs trapped under debris and bleeding heavily. She had crawled under enemy fire to reach them, administered emergency treatment, and helped carry them to safety. It was the kind of day that reminded her why she had become a medic in the first place. That night, Sarah carefully packed her medical bag, checking each item twice. Morphine, bandages, tourniquets, hemostatic agents to stop bleeding, airway tubes, and dozens of other supplies that could mean the difference between bringing someone home alive or in a body bag. She also cleaned and checked her rifle, knowing that in special operations everyone had to be ready to fight. The briefing took place at 0500 hours in a secure room lit by harsh fluorescent lights. Chief Thompson stood at the front, pointing to satellite photos on a large screen. He was a compact man with intense blue eyes and scars on his hands that told stories of previous missions. "The target is believed to be in this compound," he said, tapping the screen with a laser pointer. 3 buildings, high walls, and intelligence suggest at least 20 enemy combatants. "We're going in fast and quiet, but if things go wrong, they'll go wrong quickly." Sarah studied the photos, noting the terrain around the compound. It was mostly flat desert with a few rocky outcroppings that could provide cover. The nearest friendly forces were at least 30 minutes away by helicopter, assuming weather conditions allowed for extraction. Thompson continued the briefing, outlining their insertion point, the route they would take to the compound, and various contingency plans. Sarah paid particular attention to potential casualty collection points and the locations of cover where she might need to treat wounded team members. "Martinez," Thompson said, looking directly at her, "you'll be carrying extra medical supplies since we're going in light on personnel. 4 SEALs plus you. Everyone needs to be ready for a fight, but your primary job is to keep us breathing if things get ugly." After the briefing, Sarah had a few hours to rest before the mission. She lay on her narrow cot, staring at the ceiling of the tent and thinking about her family back home. Her mother had sent a letter the week before, telling her about her little brother's baseball games and her father's new job at the auto shop. It felt like another world, one where the biggest worry was whether it might rain during the weekend barbecue. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, Sarah heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors. Their ride was approaching. She grabbed her gear and made her way to the landing zone, where the 4 SEALs were already waiting. Besides Chief Thompson, there was Petty Officer First Class David Kim, a quiet sniper who never seemed to miss his target. Petty Officer Second Class Antonio Rivera, the team's communications specialist and explosives expert. And Petty Officer Second Class Jake Williams, the youngest member of the team but already a veteran of dozens of missions. The helicopter that would take them to the insertion point was a Black Hawk, its rotors spinning lazily as the crew made final preparations. Sarah climbed aboard and settled between Rivera and Williams, her medical bag secured to her chest and her rifle across her lap. The familiar weight of her equipment was comforting, a reminder that she was trained and ready for whatever lay ahead. As the helicopter lifted off, Sarah watched the base grow smaller below them. Soon they were flying over the rugged Afghan landscape. Mountains and valleys stretched out like a brown and gray tapestry beneath them. She closed her eyes and went through her medical procedures one more time, visualizing different scenarios and the treatments she might need to provide. None of them knew that in just a few hours, Sarah would face the most challenging situation of her military career, one that would test every skill she had learned and every ounce of courage she possessed. The mission that had started as a routine special operations raid was about to become a desperate fight for survival, where Sarah's medical training and unwavering determination would be the only thing standing between 3 SEALs and certain death. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust just as the sun began to peek over the eastern mountains. Sarah and the 4 SEALs quickly exited the aircraft, moving with practiced efficiency toward a cluster of rocks that would provide their first concealment. The pilot gave them a thumbs up and lifted off immediately, leaving them alone in the vast Afghan wilderness. Chief Thompson checked his GPS and pointed toward a ridge about 2 miles away. "That's our first waypoint," he whispered into his radio headset. "Stay low, watch for movement, and remember, we're ghosts until we reach the compound." The team moved in a tactical formation across the rocky terrain, with Kim taking point as the sniper, Thompson and Rivera in the middle, Sarah behind them, and Williams covering their rear. Each step was carefully placed to avoid loose rocks that might give away their position. Sarah's medical bag felt heavier than usual, weighted down with extra supplies for what they all hoped would be a routine mission. As they climbed the first ridge, Sarah marveled at how quietly the SEALs moved despite their heavy equipment. Years of training had taught them to flow across the landscape like shadows, stopping frequently to scan for threats and communicate through hand signals. Sarah had learned to read these signals during her previous missions with special operations teams, and she matched their movements perfectly. The intelligence reports had described the compound as isolated, but as they crested the second ridge and caught their first glimpse of their target, Sarah could see that the situation was more complex than expected. The main compound sat in a valley below, but there were 2 smaller buildings nearby that hadn't been mentioned in the briefing. Worse, they could see several armed men patrolling between the buildings. Thompson raised his hand to halt the team and pulled out his binoculars for a closer look. After several minutes of observation, he gathered the team around him. "Looks like we've got more company than expected," he whispered. "I count at least 12 hostiles, possibly more inside the buildings." Kim adjusted the scope on his sniper rifle and studied the compound. "I can take out the 2 guards on the main building from here, but once we start shooting, everyone's going to know we're here." "That's the plan," Thompson replied. "Rivera, you'll plant charges on the outer wall while Kim provides overwatch. Williams and I will breach the main building. Martinez, you stay with Kim until we need you. Then move to whatever casualty collection point I designate." Sarah nodded, checking her radio to ensure she could communicate with all team members. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. If the intelligence was wrong about the number of defenders, or if reinforcements arrived quickly, the team could find themselves badly outnumbered with limited options for escape. The attack began at exactly 1100 hours. Kim's rifle cracked twice, dropping the two guards instantly. Rivera sprinted toward the compound wall while the rest of the team provided covering fire. Sarah watched through binoculars as he placed explosive charges at 3 points along the wall, his movements quick and precise despite the enemy fire that was already beginning to pour from the buildings. The wall exploded in a shower of dust and debris, creating 3 gaps that the team could use to enter the compound. Thompson and Williams immediately rushed through the center gap, their automatic weapons firing controlled bursts at enemy positions. The sound of gunfire echoed off the surrounding hills, a harsh symphony that Sarah knew all too well. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, until Rivera's voice crackled over the radio with urgency. "Chief, we've got vehicles approaching from the east. Looks like reinforcements, at least 2 trucks full." Sarah swung her binoculars toward the east and saw dust clouds approaching rapidly. Thompson's voice came back immediately. "How long until they reach us?" "Maybe 10 minutes," Rivera replied, still firing at enemies who were trying to flank their position. The situation had just become much more dangerous. What was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission was turning into a prolonged firefight against superior numbers. Sarah knew that her role was about to become much more important than anyone had anticipated. Kim continued to provide sniper support from their elevated position, his rifle picking off enemies who exposed themselves. But Sarah could see that the team below was starting to take fire from multiple directions. Through her binoculars, she watched Williams take cover behind a low wall as bullets chipped away at the stone around him. "Martinez, we need you down here." Thompson's voice came through her earpiece, strained but controlled. "Williams is hit and we've got multiple casualties among the enemy that need searching." Sarah grabbed her medical bag and began moving down the ridge toward the compound. Kim provided covering fire as she bounded from rock to rock, using the terrain to mask her movement from enemy shooters. The sound of gunfire grew louder as she approached, mixed with shouts in multiple languages and the occasional explosion of a grenade. She reached the compound wall just as the first truck of reinforcements crested a hill to the east. Rivera was waiting for her at one of the gaps he had blown in the wall. "Williams is behind that building," he shouted over the noise of battle, pointing toward a structure about 50 yards away. "He took one in the leg, but he's still fighting." Sarah sprinted across the open courtyard, her medical training taking over as adrenaline sharpened her focus. Bullets whined past her head, but she kept moving toward Williams's position. She found him pressed against the wall of a building, his left leg bleeding through his combat pants. "About time you showed up, Doc," Williams said with a grimace, still returning fire at enemies across the courtyard. "It's not too bad, just a flesh wound, but it's bleeding pretty good." Sarah quickly cut away the fabric around the wound and applied a pressure bandage. The bullet had passed through his thigh muscle without hitting any major blood vessels, but he would need proper medical attention soon. "You'll live," she told him, "but stay behind cover and try not to run any marathons." The radio crackled with Thompson's voice. "All call signs, we've got the high-value target, but those reinforcements are almost here. We need to move to the extraction point now." Sarah helped Williams to his feet, and they began moving toward the rally point that Thompson had designated before the mission. But as they crossed the courtyard, the first truck full of enemy reinforcements arrived, and the intensity of gunfire doubled immediately. Rivera appeared beside them, breathing heavily. "Chief and Kim are pinned down in that building," he said, pointing toward the main structure. "The bad guys have surrounded them and more keep arriving." Sarah could see muzzle flashes coming from the windows of the building where Thompson and Kim were trapped. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. What had started as a successful mission to capture a high-value target was turning into a desperate fight for survival. "We need to get them out of there," Sarah said, already thinking about how to approach the building under fire. "The extraction helicopter won't be here for another 20 minutes, Rivera replied. "And I don't think we have 20 minutes. As if to emphasize his point, an explosion rocked the building where Thompson and Kim were trapped, sending debris flying across the courtyard. Sarah's radio crackled with Kim's voice tight with pain. "I'm hit bad, Doc. Chief's okay, but I can't move." Sarah looked at Rivera and Williams, seeing the same determination in their eyes that she felt in her own heart. They weren't going to leave their teammates behind no matter what the odds. The real fight was just beginning, and Sarah knew that everything she had learned about being a combat medic was about to be put to the ultimate test. Sarah stared at the building where Thompson and Kim were trapped, her mind racing through possible approaches. The structure was a 2-story concrete building with small windows, and enemy fighters had positioned themselves in a semicircle around 3 sides of it. Getting to her wounded teammates would require crossing 40 yards of open ground under heavy fire. "Doc, that's suicide," Williams said, reading her expression. Despite his leg wound, he was still functional and thinking clearly. "We need another way." Rivera was studying the compound layout through his rifle scope. "There's a drainage ditch that runs along the back wall," he said. "If we can create enough distraction, maybe one person could low-crawl through it and reach the building from behind." Sarah was already moving, checking her medical supplies and adjusting her rifle. "You two lay down covering fire on my signal. I'll use the ditch approach." "Negative," Rivera said firmly. "I should be the one going. You're too valuable to risk." "Kim is bleeding out in there," Sarah replied, her voice steady but urgent. "I'm the only one who can help him, and Thompson can't carry him alone. This is my job." Before either man could argue further, Sarah was moving toward the back wall of the compound. The drainage ditch was barely 2 feet deep, but it would provide some concealment from enemy fire. She could hear Kim's labored breathing over the radio, and she knew time was running out. The ditch smelled of stagnant water and debris, but Sarah crawled through it without hesitation. Bullets cracked overhead as Rivera and Williams opened fire, trying to draw the enemy's attention away from her position. The covering fire was effective, but it also meant the enemy knew something was happening. As Sarah reached the back of the building, she could hear voices inside speaking in rapid Dari, the local language. There were at least 3 enemy fighters on the ground floor, probably more upstairs where Thompson and Kim were trapped. She keyed her radio and whispered, "Chief, I'm at the back door." "Where exactly are you?" Thompson's voice came back immediately, quiet but clear. "Second floor, northeast corner room." "Kim's lost a lot of blood. I've got pressure on the wound, but he needs you now." Sarah studied the building's rear entrance. It was a simple wooden door with no guards visible, but that could be a trap. She took a deep breath and tried the handle. The door was unlocked, which either meant it was unguarded, or it was an ambush waiting to happen. She slipped inside and found herself in a narrow hallway, with stairs leading to the second floor. The sound of gunfire from outside was muffled now, but she could hear movement and voices from somewhere deeper in the building. Sarah moved carefully toward the stairs, her rifle ready and her medical bag secured to prevent it from making noise. The stairs creaked under her weight, despite her efforts to move silently. Halfway up, she heard footsteps approaching from the ground floor. Someone had discovered her entry point. Sarah quickened her pace, taking the stairs 2 at a time while trying to stay quiet. She reached the second-floor hallway just as voices erupted from below. Someone was shouting in Dari, probably alerting others that they had found the open door. Sarah had maybe 30 seconds before they would start searching the building systematically. "Chief, which door?" she whispered into her radio. "Third door on your right, but be careful. There might be bad guys in the room next to us." Sarah approached the door Thompson had indicated, her heart pounding. She could smell gunpowder and blood, the familiar sense of combat that always reminded her why her job was so important. She tested the door handle and found it unlocked. Inside the room, she found Thompson crouched behind an overturned table with Kim lying beside him. The sniper was conscious but pale, with a tourniquet applied to his left arm and blood soaking through makeshift bandages. A gaping hole in the wall showed where shrapnel from an explosion had torn through the building. "Thank God you're here, Doc," Thompson said quietly. "He's been bleeding for 10 minutes despite the tourniquet." Sarah immediately went to work, cutting away Kim's sleeve to examine the wound properly. The shrapnel had torn through his bicep and nicked an artery. The tourniquet had slowed the bleeding, but hadn't stopped it completely. She would need to apply direct pressure and possibly use a hemostatic agent to clot the blood. "This is going to hurt," she warned Kim as she prepared to clean the wound. "Already does," Kim replied with a weak smile. "Just fix it so I can get back to shooting bad guys." As Sarah worked, she could hear enemy fighters moving through the building below them. Voices were getting closer, and she knew they would eventually search every room. Thompson was watching the door, his rifle ready, but they all knew he couldn't hold off multiple attackers while protecting a wounded man. "How long until extraction?" Sarah asked while applying a hemostatic bandage to Kim's arm. 15 minutes, Thompson replied. "But the landing zone is compromised. Rivera says there are too many enemy fighters around the designated pickup point." Sarah finished bandaging Kim's wound and gave him a shot of morphine for the pain. The bleeding had stopped, but he was still weak from blood loss and wouldn't be able to move quickly. Getting him out of the building into safety would require careful planning and probably some luck. The radio crackled with Rivera's voice. "Chief, you've got at least 6 hostiles on the ground floor of your building and more surrounding the place. Williams and I are running low on ammunition." Thompson looked at Sarah with an expression she had seen before on other missions, the look of a leader weighing impossible options. They could try to fight their way out, but Kim couldn't move fast enough. They could wait for extraction, but the enemy was closing in and might overrun their position. Or someone would have to create a distraction big enough to draw the enemy away. "I've got an idea," Sarah said, checking her rifle and counting her remaining ammunition. "But it's going to require perfect timing." She explained her plan quickly. Thompson would help Kim get ready to move while Sarah went back downstairs and created a distraction at the front of the building. When the enemy fighters moved to investigate, Thompson could carry Kim out through the back and reach the drainage ditch. "That's incredibly dangerous," Thompson said. "You'll be outnumbered 6-1 down there." "I don't have to win," Sarah replied. "I just have to buy you enough time to get Kim out. Once you're clear, I'll follow the same route." Kim tried to sit up. "Doc, this is my fault for getting hit. You shouldn't risk your life for me." Sarah looked at both men, these warriors who had become her brothers through shared danger and mutual trust. "Nobody gets left behind," she said simply. "That's not how we do things." Before either man could argue further, Sarah was moving toward the door. She had made her decision, and now all that remained was execution. She thought briefly of her family back in Texas, of her grandmother who had inspired her to become a medic, and of all the soldiers she had treated over the years. This was what she had trained for, the moment when medical skill and personal courage merged into something greater than either alone. Sarah reached the stairs and began her descent, knowing that in the next few minutes she would either save 3 SEALs or die trying. Either way, she would do her duty as a medic and as a soldier. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the building. The enemy fighters had stopped talking, which meant they knew someone was moving through the building. Sarah reached the ground floor and took a deep breath. Everything depended on the next few minutes, and she was ready for whatever came next. Sarah moved through the ground floor of the building like a ghost, her rifle ready and her senses heightened to an almost supernatural level. She could hear voices coming from a room near the front entrance, at least 3 men talking in low tones about their search. Perfect. If she could get their attention focused on the front of the building, Thompson would have a clear path to escape with Kim through the back. She positioned herself behind a concrete pillar that would provide cover from multiple angles. From here, she could see the front entrance and had clear shots at 2 different rooms where enemy fighters were positioned. Sarah checked her ammunition one more time. 3 full magazines plus the one already loaded in her rifle. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but sufficient for what she had planned. Taking a deep breath, Sarah called out in the few words of Dari she had learned during her deployment. "Surrender now," she shouted, knowing the response would be immediate and violent, but also knowing it would draw every enemy fighter toward her position. The reaction was exactly what she had expected. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions as enemy fighters opened fire on her general location. Sarah stayed behind the pillar as bullets chipped away at the concrete around her, waiting for the right moment to return fire. Through her earpiece, she heard Thompson's voice. "Moving now. Kim's conscious and we're heading for the back door." Sarah leaned around the pillar and fired 3 quick shots at a muzzle flash she had seen from a doorway across the room. She was rewarded with a cry of pain and the sound of someone falling. But now the enemy fighters knew exactly where she was and they began to converge on her position. "How long until you're clear?" she asked Thompson while changing magazines. 30 seconds, came the reply. Sarah fired another burst at a figure trying to flank her from the left side of the room. The man dropped his weapon and scrambled back into cover. She was holding them back for now, but ammunition was running low, and the enemy was getting braver. A grenade landed near her position, bouncing off the wall behind her pillar. Sarah threw herself flat as it exploded, filling the air with dust and debris. Shrapnel peppered the walls above her head, but the concrete pillar had absorbed most of the blast. "We're out," Thompson reported. "Kim's moving under his own power. We're heading for the drainage ditch." "Copy that," Sarah replied, already planning her own escape route. She had bought Thompson the time he needed, but now she had to get out before the enemy overwhelmed her position. She fired her remaining ammunition in controlled bursts. forcing the enemy fighters to keep their heads down while she moved toward the back of the building. But as she reached the rear hallway, she heard voices behind her and realized that more enemy fighters had entered the building through the front door. The back door was only 20 feet away, but it might as well have been 20 miles. Enemy fighters were approaching from behind, and she could hear more voices outside the back door. They had discovered Thompson's escape route and were now waiting for her. Sarah's radio crackled with Rivera's voice. "Doc, we can see you're surrounded. Williams and I are moving to provide covering fire, but you need to find another way out." She looked around the hallway desperately. There was a window at the far end that faced west toward a small courtyard, but it was a 12-foot drop to the ground. With her medical bag and rifle, the fall could result in serious injury. But it was better than being captured or killed. Moving quickly toward the window, Sarah could hear enemy fighters getting closer from both directions. She used the butt of her rifle to break the glass, then cleared away the sharp edges as quickly as possible. The drop looked even farther from up here, but there was no other choice. Just as she was preparing to climb through the window, gunfire erupted from outside. Rivera and Williams had arrived and were engaging the enemy fighters who had been waiting by the back door. Sarah could hear Thompson's voice over the radio directing their fire. "Doc, the back door is clear now," Rivera called. "Move." Sarah ran back toward the rear exit, her boots echoing in the hallway. Behind her, enemy fighters were shouting and running, their voices getting closer every second. She burst through the back door and saw Thompson helping Kim across the compound toward the extraction point. "This way," Rivera called from behind a low wall about 30 yards away. Williams was beside him, still firing despite his leg wound. Both men were providing covering fire for her escape. Sarah sprinted across the open ground, her medical bag bouncing against her chest and her rifle held ready to fire. Bullets whined past her head, but she kept moving toward her teammates. The extraction helicopter was visible in the distance, approaching fast and low across the desert floor. She dove behind the wall next to Rivera, just as a burst of automatic weapons fire chewed up the ground where she had been running. "Everyone okay?" she gasped, breathing heavily from the sprint and the adrenaline. "Kim's stable," Thompson reported from their position closer to the landing zone. "The bleeding stopped and he's alert." "Good work, Doc." The helicopter was circling now, looking for a safe place to land while the crew chief scanned for enemy threats. Sarah could see the pilot talking into his radio, probably coordinating with ground forces to provide additional support. "Landing zone is too hot," came the pilot's voice over their radio. "Too many hostiles in the area. I need you to move to alternate extraction point Bravo." Sarah knew exactly where alternate extraction point Bravo was located, a small clearing about half a mile away across open desert. Moving Kim that distance under enemy fire would be extremely dangerous, especially since he was still weak from blood loss. "Negative," Thompson replied immediately. "We have a wounded man who can't travel that far. You need to land here." The pilot's response was immediate and final. "I can't put my bird down in that much fire. Move to Bravo or find another way out." Sarah looked at her teammates, seeing the same determination in their eyes that had carried them through countless missions together. Kim was wounded but mobile. Williams could still fight despite his leg injury. Rivera was down to his last magazine of ammunition. Thompson was thinking like the leader he was, weighing options and calculating odds. "We move together," Sarah said firmly. "I'll help Kim. Rivera, you take point. Williams, you're rear guard despite that leg. Chief, you coordinate movement and call in any support we can get." Thompson nodded. "Air support is 15 minutes out. Apache gunships that can clear the path to the extraction point, but we need to survive those 15 minutes first." As they prepared to move, enemy fighters began appearing at the edges of the compound. Soon they would be completely surrounded. Sarah checked Kim's bandages one more time and gave him another shot of pain medication. "Can you make half a mile?" she asked him quietly. Kim managed a weak smile. "With you helping me, Doc, I can make 10 miles if necessary." Sarah shouldered her rifle and helped Kim to his feet. Around them, her teammates were checking their weapons and preparing for what might be the longest half-mile of their lives. The helicopter circled overhead like a metal angel, waiting for them to reach safety. The race across the desert was about to begin, and Sarah knew that her medical training, her physical conditioning, and her unwavering commitment to her teammates would all be tested to their limits. But she also knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would get these 3 SEALs home alive or die trying. The first 100 yards across the desert were the longest of Sarah's life. With Kim's arm draped over her shoulder and her rifle in her free hand, she moved as quickly as possible while keeping low to avoid enemy fire. Behind them, the compound was alive with muzzle flashes as enemy fighters pursued them into the open desert. Rivera was 20 yards ahead, moving in short bounds from one piece of cover to another. Rocks, small bushes, anything that might stop a bullet. Williams followed behind Sarah and Kim, walking backward much of the time so he could return fire at their pursuers. Thompson moved between all of them, coordinating their movement and calling out threats as he saw them. "Contact right," Thompson shouted as enemy fighters appeared on a ridge to their east. Automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions, kicking up dust clouds around the fleeing Americans. Sarah felt Kim stumble and tighten his grip on her shoulder. "You okay?" she asked, not breaking stride. "Just dizzy," Kim replied through gritted teeth. "Keep moving." The morphine Sarah had given him was helping with the pain, but he was still weak from blood loss. Every step required enormous effort, but he never complained and never asked to rest. Sarah marveled at the determination of these special operations soldiers who would rather die than give up or slow down their teammates. Rivera's voice came over the radio. "Ditch ahead, maybe 3 feet deep. Good cover for about 50 yards. The drainage ditch he had spotted would provide temporary concealment from enemy fire, but it also ran parallel to their route rather than toward the extraction point. Using it would mean moving sideways instead of forward, losing precious time while enemy reinforcements closed in. Take it, Thompson decided immediately. We need cover more than speed right now. Sarah helped Kim slide down into the ditch, which was filled with about 6 inches of muddy water that smelled terrible, but would help cool Kim's fever. The wounded sniper was running a temperature now, his body responding to the trauma and blood loss. Sarah knew she needed to get IV fluids into him soon, but there was no time to stop for proper medical treatment. The team moved through the ditch in tactical formation, with Rivera still on point and Williams covering their rear. Enemy fighters were visible on both sides now, converging on their position like hunters tracking wounded prey. Sarah could hear vehicles in the distance, more reinforcements arriving to cut off their escape routes. How far to the extraction point? Williams asked, pausing to change magazines. About quarter-mile, Thompson replied, checking his GPS. But we need to get out of this ditch soon or we'll be trapped. Sarah was monitoring Kim's condition while they moved. His pulse was rapid but strong, and his breathing was steady despite the exertion. The bleeding from his arm wound had stopped completely, but she was worried about internal injuries from the explosion that had originally wounded him. Suddenly, the sound of rotor blades filled the air above them, but instead of the friendly extraction helicopter they were expecting, it was a small enemy aircraft, probably a reconnaissance bird calling in their position to ground forces. "We're made," Rivera called from the front of the ditch. "That bird's painting us with a laser designator." Sarah knew what that meant. Somewhere nearby, enemy forces were preparing to fire mortars or rocket-propelled grenades at their exact location. They had to move immediately or face devastating fire from above. "Out of the ditch now," Thompson ordered. Bound by pairs to those rocks at 2 o'clock. Sarah helped Kim climb out of the muddy water just as the first mortar round exploded behind them, sending up a geyser of dirt and shrapnel. The enemy had their range, and the next rounds would be more accurate. They ran across open ground toward a cluster of boulders about 100 yards away. Sarah could feel Kim's strength failing as they moved, but he kept putting one foot in front of the other with grim determination. Mortar rounds exploded around them, each one closer than the last as the enemy adjusted their aim. Rivera reached the rocks first and immediately began returning fire at the enemy positions. Williams arrived next, despite his leg wound, and took up a position covering their rear approach. Thompson helped Sarah get Kim behind the largest boulder, just as another mortar round exploded where they had been standing moments before. "Apache gunships are 5 minutes out," Thompson reported, speaking into his radio. "Call sign Warrior 2-1. We need immediate close air support at these coordinates." Sarah quickly examined Kim behind the cover of the boulder. His pupils were still responsive and his pulse was steady, but his skin was pale and clammy. She was worried about shock setting in from blood loss and the stress of their escape. She pulled an IV bag from her medical kit and began preparing to insert a line into his uninjured arm. "Doc, we don't have time for that," Kim protested weakly. "We don't have time not to do it," Sarah replied. finding a vein and inserting the needle with practiced efficiency. This will help replace some of the blood you've lost and give you strength for the final push. The IV bag was a battlefield expedient, not a complete solution, but enough to help Kim stay conscious and mobile for the remaining distance to the extraction point. Sarah hung the bag from her equipment harness so it could gravity feed while they continued moving. Rivera's voice cut through the sound of gunfire. Movement to the north. Looks like a technical with a heavy machine gun. Sarah peered around the boulder and saw a pickup truck with a mounted machine gun racing across the desert toward their position. The gunner was already firing, sending streams of heavy-caliber bullets that chipped away at their rocky cover. "We can't stay here," Thompson said, studying the terrain ahead. "But crossing that open ground with Kim hooked to an IV is going to be nearly impossible." Sarah looked at the extraction point, still visible in the distance where the helicopter was circling and waiting. Between their current position and safety lay 300 yards of flat desert with almost no cover. Enemy fighters were approaching from multiple directions, and the technical with the heavy machine gun would have clear fields of fire across the entire route. "I have an idea," Sarah said, her mind racing through the tactical situation. "But it's going to require everyone to trust me completely." She explained her plan quickly. Rivera would use his remaining ammunition to engage the technical and try to disable it or force it to take cover. Williams would provide covering fire for their movement despite his wounded leg. Thompson would help carry Kim while Sarah managed his medical care during the movement. But the key to her plan was unconventional. Instead of trying to cross the open ground quickly, which would exhaust Kim and make him an easy target, they would move slowly and deliberately, using Sarah's medical training to keep Kim functional while presenting the smallest possible target to enemy shooters. "You want us to walk across a kill zone?" Williams asked incredulously. "I want us to make it impossible for them to hit us," Sarah replied. "Kim can't run, so we're not going to try. We're going to use concealment, distraction, and medical support to get across that ground alive." Thompson studied her plan for a moment, then nodded. "It's crazy enough that it might work. And it's better than any other options we have." Sarah began preparing Kim for the movement, adjusting his IV line and checking his bandages one more time. She gave him a stimulant injection that would help him stay alert during the crossing, but warned him that he would crash hard afterward. "Just get me to that helicopter, Doc," Kim said with a weak smile. "I'll sleep for a week once we're safe." The sound of approaching Apache gunships filled the air, their distinctive rotor noise growing louder by the second. Sarah could see them in the distance, two dark shapes racing across the desert at high speed, but the enemy had heard them too and was preparing for their arrival. "Warrior 2-1, this is ground team," Thompson called into his radio. "We're moving to extraction point Bravo. Need you to clear the path and provide close air support." "Copy, ground team," came the reply from the lead Apache. "We have you in sight. Beginning gun runs on enemy positions now." The first Apache swept over their position and opened fire with its 30mm cannon, sending long bursts of explosive rounds into the enemy fighters who had been pursuing them. The second helicopter engaged the technical with the heavy machine gun, forcing it to retreat behind a ridge. "Now's our chance," Sarah said, helping Kim to his feet. "Everyone stays calm, everyone stays together, and everyone comes home." They began their final movement toward the extraction point, with Sarah supporting Kim on one side and Thompson on the other. The IV bag bounced against Sarah's equipment as they moved, but the line stayed secure and continued feeding life-saving fluids into Kim's system. Behind them, the Apaches continued their gun runs, systematically destroying enemy positions and vehicles. But Sarah knew the air support wouldn't last forever, and new threats could appear at any moment. The next 10 minutes would determine whether her unconventional plan would save 3 SEALs or get them all killed. As they walked across the desert under the covering fire of the Apache gunships, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility that every combat medic carries. These men had trusted her with their lives, and she was determined not to let them down. The extraction helicopter was getting closer with every step, but so were the enemy forces that were still trying to kill them. Sarah checked Kim's pulse as they moved and was relieved to find it stronger than before. The IV fluids were helping, and his color was improving slightly. But she knew he was running on pure determination now, and when that finally gave out, she would need to be ready to carry him the rest of the way if necessary. The final 200 yards to the extraction point felt like the longest journey of Sarah's military career. With Kim's arm around her shoulder and the IV bag bouncing against her equipment, she moved with steady determination across the desert floor. The Apache gunships wheeled overhead like mechanical angels, their cannons spitting fire at any enemy position that dared to reveal itself. Thompson was on Kim's other side, helping to support the wounded sniper's weight while scanning constantly for threats. Rivera moved ahead of them, his rifle ready despite having only half a magazine of ammunition remaining. Williams limped behind them, his own leg wound forgotten as he focused on protecting his teammates' retreat. "Extraction bird is beginning its approach," Thompson reported, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. 2 minutes to touchdown. Sarah could see the Black Hawk helicopter in the distance, coming in fast and low across the desert. The pilot was taking a calculated risk by landing in such a dangerous area, but Sarah knew he wouldn't leave without them. That was the unwritten code that bound all military personnel together. Nobody gets left behind. Kim stumbled slightly, and Sarah felt his full weight against her shoulder for a moment, before he recovered his footing. The stimulant injection she had given him was wearing off, and his body was beginning to shut down from exhaustion and blood loss. She checked the IV bag and was relieved to see that almost half the fluids had been absorbed into his system. "How you doing, Kim?" she asked quietly as they continued moving. "Been better," he replied with a weak smile, "but I can see that beautiful helicopter, so I'm not giving up now." Suddenly, Rivera's voice cut through the radio chatter. "RPG team, 3 o'clock high." Sarah looked toward the ridge Rivera had indicated and saw 2 enemy fighters with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. They were positioning themselves to fire at the approaching helicopter, which would be most vulnerable during its landing approach. Without hesitation, Rivera changed direction and sprinted toward the ridge. Despite being outnumbered and nearly out of ammunition, Sarah watched in amazement as the communications specialist charged directly at the enemy position, his rifle firing in controlled bursts. "Rivera, fall back," Thompson ordered over the radio. "Negative, Chief," Rivera replied, still moving toward the enemy position. "If that RPG hits our ride, we're all dead." Sarah realized that Rivera was sacrificing himself to save the rest of the team. The tactical situation was clear. Someone had to neutralize the RPG team, and Rivera was the only one in position to do it. But he was walking into almost certain death. The lead Apache gunship had seen the same threat and was maneuvering to engage the RPG team, but it was too far away and wouldn't arrive in time. Rivera reached the base of the ridge and began climbing, still firing at the enemy fighters above him. "Doc, we have to keep moving," Thompson said urgently. "Rivera knows what he's doing." Sarah wanted to help Rivera, but she knew Thompson was right. Kim needed immediate medical attention, and the helicopter was already beginning its landing approach. If they didn't reach the landing zone in the next 60 seconds, the pilot would have to abort and try again later, if there was a later. They covered the final 100 yards as quickly as Kim's condition would allow. Sarah could feel his strength fading with every step, but he never complained and never asked to stop. Behind them, the sound of gunfire from Rivera's position had stopped, and Sarah didn't want to think about what that might mean. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris, its rotors spinning at full power while the crew chief beckoned them forward. Sarah and Thompson half-carried Kim toward the aircraft, with Williams providing rear security despite his wounded leg. Just as they reached the helicopter, an explosion echoed from the ridge where Rivera had been fighting. Sarah turned to see smoke rising from the RPG position, but there was no sign of Rivera himself. Thompson was already loading Kim into the helicopter, but Sarah hesitated, looking back toward the ridge. "Doc, we have to go now," the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise. Thompson grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the helicopter. "Rivera bought us this chance," he said firmly. "Don't waste it." Sarah climbed into the aircraft and immediately began working on Kim, who had lost consciousness during the final approach. She started a second IV line and began administering emergency medications, while the helicopter lifted off and banked sharply away from the landing zone. Through the open door, Sarah could see the compound where their mission had started, now burning from the Apache gunship's attacks. Enemy fighters were scattered across the desert, some still firing ineffectively at the departing helicopter. But there was still no sign of Rivera. "Warrior 2-1, this is ground team," Thompson called to the Apache pilots. "We have 1 man missing on that ridge. Can you check for survivors?" "Copy, ground team," came the reply. "We're making a pass now." Sarah continued working on Kim while listening to the radio traffic. His vital signs were stabilizing thanks to the IV fluids and medications, but he would need surgery once they reached the base hospital. Williams was also receiving treatment from the helicopter's medical equipment. His leg wound cleaned and properly bandaged. After what seemed like an eternity, the Apache pilot's voice crackled over the radio. "Ground team, we have located your missing team member. He's alive but wounded. We're directing a search and rescue bird to his position." Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her. Rivera had survived his heroic charge against the RPG team, and soon he would be on his way to safety as well. The mission that had started as a routine special operations raid had turned into a desperate fight for survival. But somehow they had all made it through. As the helicopter flew toward the base hospital, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. She had used every skill she had learned as a combat medic, from emergency trauma treatment to tactical movement under fire. But more importantly, she had learned something about herself and her teammates that no training could have taught her. When everything went wrong and the situation seemed hopeless, they had not given up or abandoned each other. Instead, they had fought together, supported each other, and ultimately triumphed through determination and teamwork. Rivera had risked his life to save the helicopter. Thompson had led them through impossible circumstances. Williams had continued fighting despite his own wounds, and Kim had pushed himself beyond human endurance to reach safety. Sarah looked at her 3 teammates as the helicopter carried them toward medical treatment and eventual recovery. They were more than just fellow soldiers. They were brothers and sisters in arms who had shared the ultimate test of combat. She knew that no matter where their military careers took them, they would always have this bond forged in the crucible of battle. The base hospital appeared ahead, its bright lights a welcome sight after hours of desert combat. Sarah began preparing her patients for immediate surgery, knowing that the real healing would begin once they were safely on the ground. But she also knew that the emotional healing from their shared ordeal would take much longer. As the helicopter touched down at the hospital landing pad, Sarah helped transfer Kim and Williams to the waiting medical team. Thompson insisted on walking under his own power, despite the protests of the medical staff. And somewhere behind them, another helicopter was bringing Rivera home as well. Sarah Martinez had done her job as a combat medic, using her skills and courage to save 3 SEALs under fire. But more than that, she had proven to herself and her teammates that when the chips were down and survival seemed impossible, there were people willing to risk everything for their fellow soldiers. In a world where so much seemed uncertain, that knowledge was worth more than any medal or commendation she might receive. The mission was over, but the bonds formed during those desperate hours in the Afghan desert would last a lifetime.